Welcome to this session on risk in LLA. Today we're going to have a quick introduction and welcome remarks from me, and we'll do a quick scene setting exercise before getting some opening remarks from Sheila. And then we're going to have a panel discussion, and thank you for bearing with us a little bit, because the panel composition has been changing a lot over the last couple of days as we've lost various people, including this afternoon losing a speaker due to Cyclone Freddy, which is of course a good reminder of some of the risks involved in organising online workshop sessions. Then I'm going to present a little bit of a kind of a very top line typology of some of the main risks involved in doing LLA, drawing heavily from Life AR and the recent board meeting, which spent some time thinking about that. And then I'm going to move on to setting up hopefully two breakout groups, depending on how many people we have on the call, where we're going to delve into a few of the questions in a bit more detail. So briefly, I wanted to introduce our participants who have joined us today. So Sheila, who's joined us, who represents Slum Dwellers International, as well as a few other organisations, who very much a champion of the LLA movement, and I know for whom this question around risk and how risks are managed and transferred and held in development finance is a really important topic for her. So very grateful to have Sheila, who, as I said, will be doing some opening remarks and is also going to fill in for one of our missing panelists today as well. We also have Suranjana, who is at the Huare Commission, who also has a special interest in this area. And then finally, Vincent, who also has agreed to step in at the last minute from Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. So these we'll have plenty of time to speak to them during the panel session and for some questions for them as well as part of that. So moving on immediately, just wanted to quickly get us all on the same page about risk. I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's a tricky, important topic, but it's also quite difficult sometimes to talk about, and people often use quite inconsistent language when talking about it. So I wanted to start us off with a quick definition. And this is from the International Organization of Standardization. This is their definition. The effect of uncertainty on objectives, where an effect is a deviation from what is expected. And really important to stress that risk isn't necessarily a bad thing. Risk is also an opportunity. It's you have to sort of take a risk in order to get the rewards, to get the gains. And in the context of LLA, that's really important, because we're trying to change. We're trying to change from the way that development finance is currently done to something different, to something a bit more disruptive, to business unusual. And it's often expressed in terms of a combination of the consequences and the likelihood. So again, it's sort of, what are the chances of this happening and what will it lead to? And then secondly, important to clarify uncertainty. Risks always around probability, around the chance of something happening or not. And uncertainty is the lack of information about that understanding. So that's the thing, is we don't know. That's why it's a risk. We don't know how likely something is actually going to happen or not. So that's risk. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And bearing that in mind, I just wanted to do a quick scene setting exercise. Probably everybody, I'm sure, is very familiar with using Mentimeter. You just go to Menti or type Menti into Google. Click on the website and you'll be given asked to enter a code. This is the code here. And then just as a really quick scene setting exercise, I wanted to get a sense from people on the call, what is the most important risk involved in doing LLA? So you'll be prompted to answer that question. So if people could spend a minute or so just go on Menti and answer that question, so that we can get a sense of, for the people on the call, what's the most important risk involved in doing LLA? Cool, getting some answers in now. Keep them coming. But yes, seeing reputations coming up a few times. Getting a few people talking about fiduciary risks, financial risks. And also people have highlighted some of the some of the more perhaps recipient side risks that we need to think about as well in terms of maladaptation and risks around poverty and sort of geographic and physical risks, as well as just someone's actually put climate risk in there and context risk in there. So we're getting a really nice broad set of risks here, which, yes, I can't actually embed this in the PowerPoint, so I'll have to share this later. I'll find a way of sharing this later with everybody. But yeah, getting lots of really good risks coming through here. Risks of elite capture. And yeah, I think one of the main ones, well, certainly the one that's in the middle of the screen, which I'll share later, is actually flagged maladaptation, which is a really important one. So, okay, I'll stop that now. No, I've lost the PowerPoint again. Okay, brilliant. Okay, well, I'll stop share. I'll try and get this back. Okay, I think we're back. Thank you very much. I'll try and share those risks later. I'll take a screenshot or something and put it here for us to discuss. But yeah, thank you very much. And these are all the kinds of risks that we need to be thinking about today. Okay, thanks. I'll hand over to Sheila now for a little bit of some scene setting remarks and reflections. Thanks, Sheila.
So thank you very much. And I wasn't able to get into the Mentimeter, so I've missed that rich sort of narration of all the risks. But as you all know, I come as part of a social movement of people who live informally in cities. And for us, I think that the whole development industry sees poor people as risks. So it's a paradox that those who have to be at the center of creating solutions and transformations are themselves seen as risks. And I want to start with that in terms of identifying the reality in both the climate and the development space, that while in the finance sector and in international institutions, there is a lot of investment made in defining risks, the nomenclature of risks, of taking risks and monetizing it in the form of different forms of what we call insurances to ensure that that risk doesn't stick to you. But in the end, if you look at where all this ends up, it ends up with three really scary, difficult, and problematic challenges. The first one is that the conception of the potential of risks, first of all, almost ensures that the volume of resources needed to bring change and to make things happen never comes in. We've seen this in the climate space. Everybody wants billions and billions, but we hardly get millions, and then not even hundreds come to poor people. So that's one thing. And it's all related to the fact that it starts off by saying, well, we don't know that whether we have all the right instruments to deliver the resources. So the inability to deliver resources, instead of being seen as a risk that has to be overcome, becomes a criteria and a justification for not providing the resources, or for designing systems by which there are more clogs in the delivery system than actually pathways. That's the second one. The third one is that if you look at this whole process from the perspective from where poor communities and organizations that work with them, whether they are state or non-state institutions, not only are people not able to access resources, they are also increasingly and completely restricted in how they use it, what they do to use it, and how this process by 1 minute. I just want to close the door, there's lots of noise there. And how in the process of actually obtaining the resources, the very need that this resource has to fulfill remains untouched, because the environment within which the restraints allow that resource to be utilized almost ignores the reality of the larger risks that hold intergenerational, risk-related factors to actually exacerbate the situation in which poor people live, whether they are urban or rural or whatever. So instead of using the understanding of risks to navigate more safe, more predictable, and more well-organized collective transformatory processes, the detailed litany of risks actually produces all the justification for resources not to come to poor people. And if you look at this whole process in different ways, we believe that the risks of all sorts are finally heaped on those who are the final recipients, even with the little amount of money that comes. And I think that for all of us, the locally led adaptation principles for financing, for the first time, have allowed organizations of the poor and those who work with them to begin to articulate the challenges that the delivery of resources, knowledge, information, its assessments, how undemocratic and top-down they are, and therefore what needs to change. And our real challenge within the LLA process, both in the management and the articulation and the collective management of risks, is also to look at the new architecture that needs to be in place in order for all of us to collectively sort out these processes based on the skill sets that we bring to the table. So the minute all of these are located in a top-down process, they all get heaped to the bottom. But if it is in a circle where everybody understands how to deal with different sets of risks, the burden of managing all these processes becomes collective. And most importantly, the fear of failing is addressed through the spectrum of acknowledging the risks that we have to start working with. So I feel that as we build on the LLA principles, we have to take this amazing conceptual framework and look at how all of us located in different levels, in different geographies, with differing capacities and resources, are able to pool these together so that we not only fulfill the elements of the principles that we believe today to be transformative in creating this democratizing of the knowledge of managing risks into productive action that not only challenges the present pessimism of how everything is risky, to becoming solution providers and look at things that don't work, not as risks, but as impediments that have to be resolved politically, socially, financially, scientifically, or whatever way. But unless we do that, we continue the last 2 centuries of development assistance that has not really worked, and where the attributions of failure are always pushed below. So I'll stop there, and I'd really love to hear other people's examples, insights, and more detailed, nuanced reflections so that we build a body of knowledge that challenges the present development discourse as being full of risks, full of crisis and full of unsolvable problems. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Sheila. Brilliant. That's an amazing set of remarks, and yeah, I think that one of the, as you put it, sort of great opportunities of this new framework, the principles for locally led adaptation, is to think about how we can collectively share and manage risks so that we can take more risks. It's inherently a challenge to the way that conventional or traditional development finance has been done, and that risk needs to be thought about differently. And the key focus of what we'd like to do today with the questions for the panel discussion, but then also the breakout groups, is to think about what are some practical steps that we can begin that. Last year at the IIED, we developed the long-term strategy. Lots of you on this session were involved in that process. So how can we start to implement that? How can we move forwards with that in such a way where that risk's better thought about differently and shared? So yes, thinking about practical steps next, and also we'll hear from Vincent in particular some of the constraints and restrictions which are involved in the provision of these finances, and so how can we practically work within those? Great. Okay, so let's begin the panel discussion, and I'll start off, Saranjana, if you can hear, if you're with us still. I just wanted to ask you first and foremost, at the Higher Commission, what risk mapping do you currently do when it comes to programming development finance, and specifically thinking about the principles for LLA? And what are some of the main risks that you identify and seek to manage when you do that?
Thanks, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I think based on the experience that we have at the Wider Commission, I'll just pick up some of the themes that came up in the discussion from Sheila, and just give you a sense of how I see these. And I think many of these need to be, further developed and explored and understood. But just listening to Sheila, I think that one, it's very important to understand the risks, not only from the perspective of the investor side or the financial institution side, but also from the side of local communities and women's groups. And I think that is not adequately understood at all. So, for example, when we do risk mapping with local groups and local women's groups, there's a host of things that come up. And we try to constantly, because our projects are designed in that way, we try to get people to talk mainly about disaster risk or climate risk, whereas we have to acknowledge that people who are poor are living with a whole gamut of risks which they have to deal with every day, and it's a matter of their survival. So when resources come to them, that resource base is so small that they have to trade off one risk against the other. So if we design interventions that are looking at providing one set of resources just for one kind of risk, and then we say that when these resources go towards other things, so if we provide resources for microfinance, but then find people are using it for consumption, we shouldn't act like the problem is that, people are misusing funds and, these are some of the risks. The problem is actually in the design, right? So we have to recognize and acknowledge those realities, and the design of our programs or our financial flows need to address those. And I think the other thing is that we also have to acknowledge that risk is also largely, you try to give a sort of a definition and say partly it's consequences, partly it's the predictability or something like that. but whereas the institutions who drive what defines financial risk and so on are constant and who study it and have sort of created a sort of a science out of it, it isn't an absolute science. It's actually, a lot of it is based on sentiment, a lot of it is based on bias. So we have to kind of interrogate the what should I say, the rigidity with which some of these things are discussed. And I think the other thing we have to ask ourselves is, what's going on when we hear about organizations and institutions who've actually made the rules and have the sort of state-of-the-art risk management strategies and, are doing this very high-level financing. And then we find out that, there's some kind of a major crisis because everybody is over-leveraged, the books are messed up, there's all this, then I think, and valuations are wrong, some institutional assets are overvalued. In that same vein, I think we have to also understand that the communities that we work with, what they bring to the table in addressing the problems around locally led adaptation are being undervalued. And we have to realize that local communities and grassroots networks bring their own set of risk mitigation strategies which need to be understood. Many of those have to do with collectivizing, building very strong trust networks, trusted partnerships, and a lot of investment is made in developing these and using these networks to innovate and test and transfer effective strategies. And that's why we get so disturbed, I think, when those networks get disrupted or disturbed. So I think, we have to look at what real risks people are experiencing. We have to stop pretending like everybody who has more power actually has all the answers and can predict everything. They actually can't. And then we have to develop strategies together and that's why it's terribly important to sort of to interrogate the kind of institutional architecture that exists and try and rebuild that in a completely different way. Thanks.
Thank you, Suranjana. Yeah, brilliant. And that's exactly that question of how do we actually go about reflecting the risk perspectives, appetites, and understanding of grassroots organizations, communities. Hopefully that's something we can start to talk a little bit more about towards the end of, in the breakout sessions of this call. Thank you very much. Vincent, I wonder if I can ask you, of course, the principles for LLA are still relatively new, a couple of years old, they were formalized, but you've got the FCDO, or the UK, has got a long experience, of course, in funding small-scale local interventions. So are there any ways that FCDO thinks differently around risk, or even manages risks differently when programming LLA compared to other development finance? Just reflecting specifically on what Suranjana just said around how local groups, communities have that different perspective, set of skills, etc.
Thanks, John. And just wanted to say how much of a pleasure it is to be on the same panel as Suranjana and Sheila. Always great and really challenging to get their perspective. Really enjoy it. And they really do challenge us as donors to think differently. And that is a real issue. I'm a small cog in a big organization, and despite sort of cuts in aid budgets in recent years, we still have significant sort of clout with the amount of money that we're spending on development finance. And it's the analogy of the supertanker changing direction. We're LLA, yes, we've got experience on previous programs like the BRACED program, where we did a lot of work with local level organizations across 13 countries in Africa and Asia. We had a look at the sort of piloted ideas for devolved climate finance and local organizational sort of leadership in this. But essentially, we're still quite way down on the learning curve on how to do LLA effectively. Working in an organization that still has not yet bought into this as an organization. As a component of that organization, we're fully committed. We've been supporting LLA work since the UN Climate Action Summit. We've been supporting IIED and WRI to build a community of practice. and to crowd in more people to sign up to the principles, endorse the principles. We have over 140 organizations and governments or whatever signed up now. So we've got a real community building around that. And we've also, as you mentioned, John, we supported the Life AR initiative. So, we've really tried to put our money where our mouth is, put our money on the table and say we've committed to these principles. And the way that we're going to demonstrate that is by supporting an LDC-led initiative that's asked us for specific support in moving money down to local level and supporting community-led, community-based adaptation initiatives. And that's what we're trying to do. That's how we're trying to change the way that we do business. But the leverage we have at that level with that amount of funding is quite small. So we've got a lot resting upon providing proof of concept of how financing locally led adaptation can work before we start changing the way that development finance in general, in the modalities of that development finance, the rather more sort of top-down traditional modalities of delivery of that development finance. So we're investing a lot in our support for LLA, we're investing a lot in our support for Life AR, and say this is going to be our proof of concept of how potentially we can do this. And if we can prove that, we could start to change the direction of that super tanker. I think Sheila's point right back at the beginning was really, really important about volume of resources, because at the moment, the resources that are being committed by us, by co-donors, for example, to the Life AR initiative, the USA, to Ireland and some others, which we're trying to crowd in on this, are still very, very small. They're really nothing near the sort of level that is required to actually support the demand that's coming to us from national, subnational and local level for whether it's sort of A&R finance, adaptation and resilience, or now much more the discussions around loss and damage as well, and supporting sort of loss and damage at those levels. So the volume is wildly insufficient to be able to support that level of finance. So what we're doing is we're testing the water at the moment. We've not actually taken the plunge at a significant scale in order to be able, with the initiatives that we're directly supporting, to make sort of transformational change. The opportunities we do have, though, are through the big instruments, people like the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, which put in the billions that are required rather than the millions that we're putting in. And whether we can now help to change the course of those big funding instruments to support locally led adaptation more effectively, whether we can overcome the accreditation hurdles that they require of accredited entities in country to actually open up that sort of floodgate that's required to support local level adaptation. That's our direction of travel. That will take time. We're dealing with large embedded entities and instruments which have a particular way of doing business, which will take us time to sort of move those goalposts. So I think we've got a process, we've got a trajectory. We don't have a solution yet. We're on that path, and we're not going to meet those challenges yet that Sheila raised about raising the volume, and also about the challenges that Suranjana raised about looking at risk at local level and sort of incorporating that. We think about risk all the time, about risk to us as an institutional donor. How are we exposed? What's our reputational risk? What's the fiduciary risk around this? As it starts to move, the money starts to move down to local level, we could start working as we are now, particularly with the governments of Uganda and Ethiopia, to start opening up those discussions at local level through local government, through local organizations, to help to embed their perception of risk into our analysis of risk, to help us understand more effectively how they perceive risk and how they can manage and minimize that risk, and make it much less about the fear that we have about how our taxpayers' money will be used to support these initiatives and how that exposes us. Back to you.
Thanks, Vincent. Yeah, that's really helpful. And yes, how to actually reflect and incorporate local perceptions of risk is really important challenge. And I wonder if Sheila, you could comment on that. In my mind, I'm just thinking a little bit about the urban poor funds that the SDI have overseen. And specifically, if you could talk about sort of how initiatives like that, but also more generally, have actually reframed and understood the risk around communities, the risk around women's groups at the community level, and reframed those as actual opportunities, whereby you can orient projects around them, and actually realize enormous benefits. But how did you actually reframe the risk involved in, say, some of those the projects, the Urban Poor Fund, for example? Oh, you're on mute.
I want to start off by looking at social movements as the most critical instrument that provides risk management to the most vulnerable communities, because that collective behavior, that federating of communities, that aggregating of those facing similar problems is the first step in creating a large volume of people who share knowledge, share strategies, share resources, and create a process that cushions the potential individual losses that occur. It's not very different from the insurance model, but this is a people's model. And I don't think that organizations like Vincent's or others in development have understood this very well. Because what we've done in development is we've projectized everything. So you have challenges that are intergenerational that we want to sort out with an investment of 3 to 5 years and a monitoring and evaluation system, which is completely alien and insufficient, and therefore creates the nomenclature of risks by the fact that those issues are not undertaken, and therefore it produces reputational damage and all the things that Vincent was talking. So the first mismatch is that the way in which poor people manage risks is still not understood by the development business and the development industry and now the climate industry. That's one. The second thing is that for the full world, starting from the UN, development and SDGs is one silo and climate is another silo. But when you're dealing with very poor people, they are together. And in today's world, every single development dollar must be spent with a long-term climate perspective. So by keeping these two things separate, we're also further exacerbating risks that they become dysfunctional and therefore they produce more fear and more hesitation to make investments. So it's like a reverse cycle, it's like a reversal of good investments, good management, good systemic development. The third very important thing is that deep intergenerational poverty that started in rural areas, came into the cities in our case, has deep governance deficits in the local context. And poor people's lives and the potential for them and their organizations to get money are like, they are like between the devil and the deep sea. On one hand, there are not good governance structures. There's a deficit of transparency. There is no local and national buy-in to support groups that remain marginalized and invisible. And then development assistance gets more hesitant to come in because the governance structures and the legal frames are not working. So that burden of everybody's perception of risks further destroys the potential possibility of something changing in poor people's lives. And that is never considered, that that between the global, national, and local governance structures, the real people who suffer that process are the poor. We have the same problem with, I give you a very interesting example. I'm right now doing this campaign called Roof Over Our Heads, which is seeking to acknowledge that 93% of people who live in cities design, construct, and finance their homes, despite being illegal, have the fear of evictions, live in the most vulnerable locations, and yet most development assistance does not come to them because in the city planning structure, they are illegal. But their vulnerability makes them most vulnerable to disasters and terrible events of depletion of their resources. So these paradoxes just increase the challenges and risks and burdens that keep getting heaped on poor people. And I think that's what we as STI, and I know Suranjana's Viro Commission, you take the Waste Pickers Network, you take all the social movements of urban and rural poor, why they are important, why they are formed, why people should invest in them, have not been seen through the risk management and mitigation lens. People are actually more fearful rather than seeing them as important safety nets for poor people. So I feel that in our discussions, looking at people's long-term capacity to remain organized has yet to be defined as a risk management process. So, Mr. IIED, you will write that down and champion it. Back to you.
Thanks, Sheila. And yes, I hope our note takers made a note of that. that can definitely be front and center. Thank you very much. I wanted to come back to Suranjana and ask, accepting this big issue in terms of the way that, as you've already said, that local communities and women's groups aren't currently represented very well. Their perspectives aren't represented very well. I wonder if you had any positive experiences that you could reflect on, whereby you've worked with any partners in a way which has actually reduced some of the burden of risk management. We hear a lot about how compliance, fiduciary compliance, some of the reporting burdens, etc., can be very significant and can really squeeze timescales for implementation and reduce the impact of things like locally led adaptation. And I was wondering if you had any positive examples you could share where any kind of partner has tried to make some changes to reduce those burdens, to streamline processes, or to better reflect the broader suite of risks as you see them in your communities.
So I think one is certainly the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, and who have provided unearmarked funding, which could be used by the Wild Commission and our members in this last 1 or 2 years, and we have been using that to strengthen the financial systems of our groups. But also, I think the funds that we had from CEDA for our Community Resilience Fund, which during the COVID crisis, we found that basically there was a huge demand from member organizations to fund them because they were in such crisis. And we were able to then repurpose provide those funds to the groups and allow them to take action, particularly those who were doing collaborative work with the government, received support. But also, we had 2 rounds of funding where people whose proposals were kind of weak were assisted and supported to receive funds in the second round. And also, we've been hearing a lot from donors about the need for more stringent financial systems and bookkeeping on our side. So we've been spending resources on creating a diagnostic tool that looks at what is the situation of groups, because we have very diverse groups, some who have a lot of professional staff and support, some who don't, and we've been supporting them to upgrade their financial systems and keeping. So there are examples, and there's also the example of the Asian Development Bank, which has set up the Community Resilience Partnership Program. God, I forget the name. But it's an example of I mean, they've created a different window, right? And a multi-donor trust fund to do this. I mean, it's not exactly a risk. It's not a risk management strategy, but it's really saying that you can't have the same entity that does mainstream financing for something that is supposed to work for communities. So I think in that sense, it's and also I would challenge Vincent actually on his statement where he says, they're on this learning curve. I think there are a lot of examples that one keeps hearing of FCDO and DFID in its previous avatar have done in the past very, very innovative work where they've provided very flexible resources to groups, and they have a lot of experience doing that. And I think they need to bring that into the climate space much more.
Thanks, Saranjana. I tell you what, I will ask Vincent quickly to come back there, and more broadly, given some of the constrictions and restraints that you set out earlier, but then also what we just heard in particular from Saranjana, what's sort of the role of intermediaries and intermediation in trying to bridge the gap between what you've set out and some of the alternative sort of vision and experience from Sheila and Saranjana, and do we need, or does FCDO need to have new, maybe some different intermediary structures in place? Is that one alternative? So yeah, it'd be really useful as perhaps a final question or final reflection on that sort of intermediation and how that can be used to help bridge this.
Great. Always welcome these challenges. And yes, Saranjana, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have got a track record. I mean, I mentioned being quite sort of new on the learning curve, and you're right to say that. I mean, I referenced the BRACED program, but the BRACED program was quite widely spread, and we've got other programs other than BRACED, but there's still a great deal to learn how to do it properly, and it's pulling all those different contexts together, a sort of understanding what are the common themes across the different contexts of the different countries, to pull that into our institutional learning, and that perhaps has not been done as well as could have been done in recent years. And I think there's a great deal still we can draw upon, and there are huge, I suppose, reference sources still available where we can draw upon that experience. So we are doing so. I mean, we continue to do so. The prior BRACE program provides a very rich source of learning on locally led adaptation and working with local organizations. And FCDO draws upon that still, and we point other people constantly in that direction to draw upon that learning. So you're right in that respect, but I'm trying to sort of be a bit humble about this and saying, we don't, as a donor, we don't know everything about this yet. We are still learning. There's still a lot going on in the space of locally led adaptation that we want to learn from practitioners, and the type of examples that you've given, that Sheila's given, about how we can incorporate those local voices more effectively, I think is important. I see, Saranjana, you got your hand up. Before I sort of continue with the next bit, John, do you mind if I sort of ask Saranjana to come back on that?
Please.
No, I'll come back after you finish. Please go ahead and finish. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you now.
That's okay. That's all right. Quite happy. Let's keep it informal. John, you asked about intermediaries. I mean, at the moment, for example, as regards, Life AR is our flagship initiative at the moment on supporting locally led adaptation. There are a range of intermediaries down the delivery chain to local level that we're working with, and they are all assuming a level of risk that we are vesting in them and vesting trust in them to manage at those different levels. I mean, the primary intermediary for us is IIED, and IIED manage the secretariat function of Life AR and therefore manage the finance flows and the delivery chains and the relationships with the LDC group, etc. But of course, that's a great deal. That's a very big ask to ask one organization to take that on. So we're looking at the whole delivery chain and the whole structure and how we can work with them to manage their particular levels of risk. And the next level for us, if we're going down rather than up from the bottom, are the national governments with whom we work. So in each of the countries whom we're working, we've got commitment at national government level to take on this process of delivering climate finance to support local action. And governments like the governments of Uganda and Ethiopia, Malawi and Burkina Faso and the Gambia have all committed to do this and developing national platforms in order to manage that strategic approach to moving climate finance down to support local level, and then defining the risk, the risk landscape they're having to face in order to do that, and they're having to take on. We haven't yet, because we're still relatively early in establishing those national structures, we haven't mapped this down to local level yet. But at each level, we're working with a layer of organizations who accept and are managing those risks through local government organizations, through community-based organizations. We go through the standard methodologies of due diligence at particular levels, and recognizing that due diligence is a increasingly onerous task the further down the delivery chain you reach. When you're working with local organizations, to expect them to have to meet the same standards of due diligence that an organization like IIED or a national government is expected to meet clearly is unacceptable, is unrealistic. So we're having to look at what those risk levels are, and then deciding on how the intermediaries can manage that risk down the chain. So, for example, IIED will then establish the risk levels further down the chain and say what process we need to follow to reach an acceptable level of risk management while we continue to work with those organizations. So for us, intermediaries are critical. It's not about FCDO standing over this and watching, sort of supervising at a sort of micro level, micromanaging this program. It's about us stepping back and being part of a broader organization of, I suppose we've taken on the Life AR partnership principle of equity. We're trying to embed that into the way that we work and saying that we're equal partners, and we're trying to enable each of those partners to have an equal level of responsibility towards the way that they're both delivering and managing risk through that process. I'm not sure if that answers your question fully, and perhaps you can come back to Suranjana now. Is that okay, John?
Thanks, Vincent. Yep, Suranjana, go ahead.
Thanks. No, I just wanted to, I think my mind is a little slow on this theme, and today particularly. But, this question about what's the biggest risk? I mean, I think one of the big things that we're plagued by is the fact that we are trying to create a technical fix in the climate space for something that is an intensely political process and a highly contested process. And most of the time, that's, so that's part of what creates this sort of very disparate, disjointed approach to problem solving. But then I think, in addition to what Sheila talked about, what the role of social movements is basically then to come in and say, well, even though this isn't the most favorable of circumstances or opportunities, let's see how we can turn it into an opportunity and work with the constituencies that we partner with to enable them to develop different kinds of solutions. And the other, I think, big problem with sort of turning everything into a risk, particularly the risk of failure, is that then stymies the process of innovation, right? And ultimately, I think also when you look at the shifting timeframes that we're now talking about, that going from a 1 year, 2 year project to looking at 7 to 10 years, then everything that, or particularly the risks around failure, could certainly be opportunities for innovation, right? So the time frame can make such a difference to how you view, or you could look at, people who represent a risk in terms of financial risk, and you don't know how, what their money management skills are or capacities are. You look at it over time, and if you make that investment in improving that, then it's actually an opportunity to increase their capacities, and it's a no regrets opportunity, right? So I think that there are two kind of countering factors, right, to risk. One is that when is it a risk and when is it an opportunity? And of course, from the perspective of movements, there's also the quote unquote antidote to risk becomes sort of this idea of building trust and trusted networks. And that's actually the basis on which a lot of businesses are. Again, that, I don't know, in economics, that's part of it is called transaction cost, and how you get to know people, all kinds of other words are given. But actually, it's the human ability to build relationships, to do collaborative learning. And that's why we are so invested in those kinds of processes of collaborative learning and building trust that actually then allows people to share the real lessons, where they succeed, where they fail, and gives people the confidence to keep trying, even when they fail. So I think we have to look at both these things. What's the opportunity when you reframe the risk as opportunity, but also when you reframe risk and you address trust as a risk mitigation tool. Thanks.
Brilliant.
I want
Thanks,
to add
Ranjana.
another risk.
So, okay, Sheila, I'll ask you to be quick because we're running out of time. But yeah, go on. You can have the final word of the panel.
Okay. For me, another paradox of the fear of risk is the non-absorption of allocated resources. This is one of the biggest things that is a paradox in development investments. The money is not enough, but it doesn't get utilized. And it doesn't get utilized because everybody's put so many restraints that it can't move towards those who need. So I don't know how many of you have actually studied the funds that remain unutilized, both national and global, because they were designed to be so risk averse that they don't get spent. And I think that's a very important thing to put in a time when there is a paucity of resources. So it's a paradox. You don't have enough money and then you don't do that. So I feel that, and I think that the analysis of impact and outcomes, both in terms of learnings from mistake or leverages that are done, which may not be only monetized, are also not brought into the discussions of looking at the value of the investment and impact. Therefore, when you only look at everything that is being done from a risk framework, you only see negativity. Just wanted to add that. Okay.
Thank you, Sheila. Brilliant point. Thank you very much. Okay, so ends our panel. I think what we're going to do is not do breakout groups on account of the fact that there aren't too many people on the call. Actually, I think, it says here 16 participants, and that includes our speakers and a few from IIED. So we'll do that in plenary instead. However, I will briefly go back to the slides because I just want to quickly share some of the top line kind of risks that came out of the Life AR meeting before as to sort of set up the to set up the group discussion. And I'm also going to not have any questions off the back of the panel discussion, again, partly because we're running out of time, and sorry, we started late and the panel ran over because we were having such good conversation there. But again, because we're going to be in plenary, we will be able to just speak directly with this, ask questions directly with the speakers as we go. I'm going to attempt to share my screen again. Has that worked?
No. Now it does.
No. Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah. No. Now it's gone.
Back?
Yes, back.
Okay, perfect. Right, I'll race through this, but this is something which will soon be publicly available as well. This is, I pulled out some of the top line risks from the Life AR recent board meeting, just to give a bit of a flavour of some of the risks that have been articulated by that forum, which are, of course, sort of similar to the risks involved in LLA, but it's slightly different, of course. And I'll just quickly point out some of the kind of the key features of this and how they really how we can kind of try and take those forwards into our conversation in the discussion next. So actually 8 were identified. I'm only going to talk about 6 today because 2 of them were quite specifically about the governance of Life AR. So the first one, and this one's been touched on a few times really, is sort of partnership risk. Life AR and LLA are really there to sort of change the way that development is done, and that involves different partnerships, different relationships. This is, of course, something which is central to the LLA strategy as well. But there are huge risks involved in this. That these partnerships don't work, that trust's undermined, that various kind of political events or simply operational events can really undermine the partnerships, leading to LLA not being implemented or a lack of impact of LLA. It's a very large risk, but it's also perhaps one of the greatest opportunities of LLA is actually around these partnerships. The second one is around program design. And again, this is quite closely related actually to the third one around implementation. But again, if we're thinking about business unusual in LLA, then there's a risk that we don't get to get there. We don't sort of follow through with the ambition, and we end up designing programs which are a bit safer, a bit more status quo. Equally, something that came out of the Life AR meeting, this risk that only a few strong individuals, front runners, end up actually pushing this, and it's not sort of more broadly accepted and understood. It's quite similar with the implementation as well. Again, sort of similarly, that we don't see that these plans get implemented, so that we don't get to scale, so that we lack the demonstration effect that we need. Another risk, which is really always comes up time and time again, is around reputation. It's clearly really important to the providers of finance, especially given the high scrutiny and the kind of audit culture that surrounds aid in provider countries. But there's also this very large and important sort of reputational aspect for all of the actors in the finance delivery chain. And again, we can think clearly about how LLA as a movement, lots of people are very invested over a long period of time in this. There's a reputational risk for people like Sheila, people like Suranjana, who've invested a lot in this, and their organizations for whom failure and might then slide back to a business as usual approach could really undermine a lot of the work that's been going on for a lot longer than we've been talking about the principles for LLA. People risk, and this is something which came up a lot in the Mentimeter slide. There are some seriously important risks to consider, the impact on people. Again, this idea that there's the people involved in actually doing this work in recipient contexts, there's a lot of stress involved. There's potentially lots of abusive situations which can emerge as well, let alone things like high staff turnover and just simple well-being around the fact that this is really hard, which could again lead to issues in terms of implementation and realizing the potential. And finally, this idea about finance and compliance, again, really important, but there are lots of risks around this. Poor compliance can lead to the money not being reallocated in future. Overly sort of onerous compliance can massively restrict the implementation. It can squeeze timescales, it can divert resources, etc. It can contribute to some of those issues around people as well, if the finance and compliance situation requirements are too great and ultimately contribute to bad working environments. So I just wanted to share those kind of top line risks. They might resonate with you. They might be other ones that you think are far more important. But this is kind of, if you like, some top line risks in LLA. And now what we'd like to do for the rest of the session really is to discuss those kind of 2 top line questions I introduced at the very top of the session. We were going to do these in 2 breakout groups, but we'll just do it in plenary. So maybe we'll start with the first one, and perhaps devote a little bit more time to the second. So yes, this kind of important question: what type of risks are currently being managed in LLA, in the implementation of LLA, and how are these actually impacting people? What are the kind of effects of some of these policies and processes on actually doing LLA? So I'll open the floor there, but of course, please feel free to speak to any of these kind of prompt questions. But this kind of broad idea: what's it actually like to actually implement projects in terms of risk management, and how does that impact it? Does anyone want to open us up? Just kick us off.
John, I'll come in with the boring donor perspective to start with, and I'm sure that will stimulate other perception. I mean, we talked a bit about it in the last session, in the panel discussion as well. And as a donor coming into an area which, for us, business unusual is, we don't do business unusual as a donor. Business unusual, I'm not sure we even understand yet what business unusual is. So we're still sort of working our way into what is it that we're going to do differently that we don't do, currently under our normal development finance support. And always the question that will come back to me as the sort of technical lead, as the SRO overseeing this program for FCDO, is what's our exposure? What's our financial exposure? What's our reputational exposure? Now, I understand that from the perspective of Sanjana and Sheila and other organizations at the grassroots, that is something that they quite rightly challenge, and will say that the risks are probably much higher for communities than they are for us. But we are faced with a constrained budget, a government that is, quite sort of, I suppose, managing its finances quite tightly, and we have to be accountable to the way that we're spending donor money on these programs. So always we're being asked to assess fiduciary risk, the risk of loss and wastage in the system, and what it will mean to us if the program fails to deliver. We've talked a lot about projectized approaches, and I totally agree. We're trying to move towards a strategic way of delivery, to move climate finance into the strategic place and away from a projectized approach. But that is not the way that, as a donor, we do business as yet. And we are stuck in short-term timescales, and they expect to be delivery within that timescale. And if you don't get delivery, one has to explain the reasons why, and potentially with a risk, therefore, that further funding will not be forthcoming. So at the top of our mind at the moment, as a donor, those are the rather prosaic but very real risks that we have to manage in the first instance, whilst maintaining and developing the conversation with the delivery chain, delivery partners, with the intermediaries, and ultimately at community level, about how we can help them better support the multifarious risks that they're supporting down that process. So I'll throw that in at the beginning to get the conversation moving, and quite happy to be challenged by those who will come back and say, that's not what it's all about. So thanks.
Thanks, Vincent. Would anybody like to come back and challenge Vincent, or to reflect on what he's just said, and really start thinking about, well, actually, how does that impact people on this call when doing their work, and what kind of changes might you be able to suggest or seek?
We want more audience participation.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Khalil,
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. John, you counted 6 risks through your 2 slides. And, people are at liberty to quantify other risks also. My huge concern is, which is aligned with Sujana's and Mrs. Patel's concerns. Suppose if these risks exist, then or the new risks evolve, then don't we just move on and then cater to the people at the grassroots level? And like Sujana says, every failure at least gives us the learning prospects. So this is a catch-22 situation for those people. And then we have discussed already, how funds get diluted and what remains to be there for the people who are supposed to be served. So same way, the time that we are spending on these things is really also pushing us behind to really take real initiatives to serve those people. So it is just my reflection, and then there is a very able panel here. They would like to comment on this.
Thank you, Khalil. And I wondered just if you could follow up that, Khalil. And do you get much opportunity to actually feed that back, that perspective, to people you work with, to your partners? Do you have an opportunity to voice that outside of this session, of course?
Yes, I do. I work, in Southeast Asia, and mostly for the potable water and in the natural resources sector. But when it comes to natural resources, water always leads. And recently, we are a Dutch concern, but then we work in Southeast Asia. And then recently, after the floods in Pakistan, we were there to, help out those people. But here also, there's one more challenge which these able ladies would like to reflect. You know, bureaucracy at the government level really plays the role. And my biggest risk is because the regulations are that way, you can't really move. And then donors also, they want you to be a legal entity in any area that you operate. And when you are legalized, you're really not responsible to those people that you are serving, but by default, you get responsible to the bureaucratic channels of the governmental channels. So that is the challenge that we face in these areas. And same goes in other South Asian countries. Please correct me if I'm wrong, ladies.
Thanks, Khalil. Does anyone else want to come in? Do we not have anybody who wants to come back in thinking about any of these sort of prompt questions in the first breakout group list, thinking about risks which are currently sort of managed and the impact of those risk management?
So can I come in and say something?
Please, yes.
So I think we also have to think, all the different kinds of donors and finance providers and investors have to think about what the opportunity cost is of not doing something, of not investing in the urban poor, in local grassroots women's groups, in social movements. What is the opportunity cost of that? And, I just want to reiterate the thing that you've said on the transaction costs and the due diligence costs and how that has an impact on staffing. So that is putting so much pressure that on the human resources of movements and organizations, that I think, again, people have to think about, or the donors have to think about, is that what they really want? Is that where they want the energy of these organizations to go? And okay, Vincent belongs to FCDO, but there are other kinds of donors out there. There's also there are private philanthropies. They don't need to behave like they are banks. They don't need to follow take the same route that bilateral agencies are taking, right? So there's a different way that they can do things. And the other risk that I want to talk about also is the fact that often what is considered sustainable is being, again, defined in quite a restrictive way sometimes, which is about, which is equated with being market-friendly, marketable. And that's not, that has a huge amount of risks for poor people too. So I think that's a risk that you haven't listed there. Thanks.
Thank you, Saranjana.
Let me try another possible, another reflection, if I may come in. Trust and familiarity and comfort in truth saying comes out of long-term relationships. One of the challenges of, Vincent has heard me say this many times, one of the challenges in the development business is the amazing turnover of northern institutions and the lack of history on their own successes. So somebody like me who's doing this for 30, 40 years, I find that I know more about those interesting innovations that worked with different organizations, which is not there in the institutional memory of those organizations. And therefore, we cannot become the historians of those processes because we are not seen as reliable third-party providers of that. But in reality, long-term relationships produce better communication mechanisms, because the other very big challenge in working with very vulnerable communities is not only the challenge of the local bureaucracy, which is often at odds with people who are extremely poor and living in difficult circumstances and treated like, you know, beneficiaries and consumers of everybody else's charities. There's also this whole challenge of quickly and constantly changing priorities as the local situation changes. How do these things get communicated is as aberrations that have to be feared and which add to the risk, rather than seen as positive, quick responses to changing challenges. And now we see that a lot in post-disaster or long-term crisis situations where everything moves a lot in terms of what the priorities are, what needs to be done first and second. And those things constantly require affirmation from the major donors. And the feedback loop is often very long. People get impatient, they do what they want, and that is seen as a very serious risk. So the ability to communicate the non-hierarchical, honest reflections of what's not working, these are all actually real risk management systems that are used very efficiently amongst those who are equal. But they don't somehow operate in the development chain in which communities and their networks are literally at the bottom. And I think that's one of the things that the LLA principles tries to change. We need to do modest programs. You don't have to do your large programs. Start with modest programs that produce new ways to communicate and new ways to address the shifting nature of how choices keep having to be made to look at different alternatives where, especially in the climate space, where people are not familiar with all the solutions or all the strategies, the state is uncomfortable about it as well. And I think in Life AR, you will find that aligning what national governments, regional, state or city level or district level groups want to do is as misaligned as that of the primary donor and the final recipient.
Thank you, Sheila. Okay, we don't have very much time left. So, Helen, I see you've got your hand up, so I'll let you come in now. And also, if we could just spend a little bit of the time we have left also, if anybody wants to volunteer any risks that are currently not accounted for in existing risk management strategies, any specific ones. But Helen, I'll let you come in.
Thanks, John. I was actually just reflecting on some of those comments and kind of the hearing of, and we haven't got time today, but I'd be really interested to hear more from Suranjana and others about the CGARF experience, just thinking about the point you made about different types of funders and their different approaches to then dealing with risk. We've talked a lot, and Vincent is here on behalf of, I shouldn't say all bilateral donors, but as a bilateral donor with a very different set of pressures perhaps to a private philanthropy or philanthropist organisation. So it'd be quite interesting to kind of see how learning of different approaches might cut across those two. And having worked for a donor for many years, Sheila, I loved your point about the fact that institutional learning perhaps is not as, and memory is perhaps a challenge, let me put it that way. Just in terms of maybe moving into your second question, John, one of the things I was going to ask people's views on was one of the risks that came up in the Mentimeter actually around maladaptation. And I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more from perhaps the people who put that in there in terms of what that looks like from their experience, or what kind of the way in which you manage that is through the programming and through LLA principles.
Thank you, Helen. Does anybody who put maladaptation in their Mentimeter submission want to come in?
I can tell you one if nobody else wants in cities.
Go on then, Sheila. Oh no, Saqib, you've got your hand up, so I'll let you jump in ahead of Sheila.
No, let Saqib talk.
No, please, Sheila, please go ahead.
We've talked a lot. Come on, we need other voices.
Go, Saqib, and then Sheila, you can come in after.
I think just picking up on the point of maladaptation, one of the risks that we've sort of been running into quite a lot is that a lot of the funding, whether they're from sovereign donors or funding bodies themselves, is very risk averse. It's not taking the risk for you to fail and try something innovative. And I think as has been touched upon, and Vincent mentioned, that we're all still learning, even from the funding bodies side, we're all really sort of learning. If you're in a learning process, you have to be able to be allowed to fail. And if you're working with communities that haven't really had good experiences before, but they're still willing to try, you're trying projects, especially in the era of loss and damage, where you really haven't got, a clear indication scientifically even about what would be the good steps to take. You have to be allowed to fail so that you're able to really learn from some of those lessons. And that, I think, particularly in funds themselves, perhaps the sovereign donors are a little bit more reflexive because they understand a little bit more of the political economy in the different contexts that they're working in. But the funding bodies themselves are extremely risk averse, where you're really not allowed to fail. And quite often the criticism of big funding applications for the Adaptation Fund and GCF and even Jeff are that you're writing a proposal that, more or less has to have all of its outcomes and outputs well-defined, well in advance of you receiving any funding. You're already targeting, how many beneficiaries you're going for, what sort of impacts you're already going to achieve. And it's quite difficult when you're sort of building up from community level activities to have that kind of specificity. And that's something that you really learn by trial and error. You do a little bit in this context, it works. Even in a country as small as Bangladesh, where I'm based, something works within the South in the community there, but you have to try a different approach in the North. And you do that by trial and error. You run a program in the North that doesn't run successfully. You see what elements work and you try something different the next phase. So really having a little bit more flexibility in terms of failure, but, having that emphasis on learning. And that's something that I think quite a lot of the funds and funding bodies need to be a little bit more cognizant of. Over to you, Sheila.
Well, I want to give the biggest maladaptation challenge in urban areas, which is water-based sewage treatment. It's every city's dream in the global South to have a sewer system. And the only sewer system that most municipalities have in their procurement and their systems is water-based. And in India, from the 5,800 municipal bodies that are there, less than 100 have any form of sewer system, and all of them are water-based. And yet all the cities are water scarce. So you have a serious challenge of universal access to water and sanitation. Now, locked in a situation where the conventional ways, the last 200 years of how to produce universal sanitation, which is water-based. And yet now we know that that's not acceptable, and the alternatives remain very, very expensive as well. So people like us who want to produce citywide stopping of open defecation, for instance, are locked in this maladaptations crisis, that the cities only have this old-fashioned way of looking at things. The market hasn't produced a solution that is affordable and is not part of the city code. So here's a very big thing which is going to impact cities all over the world. The same thing is happening in construction, where steel and glass have become the major, the major style content of all commercial buildings in all metropolitan cities, which are the worst things in terms of heat in the global south, where all of us are facing such heat levels as we have never done. And then the elite use more air conditioning to cool down those things. So cities are full of these kind of maladaptations, and the kind of depth and rigor that we need to put into producing alternatives have no investors, have not enough science that produces alternatives, and legitimates non-provision of basic amenities and services. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Sheila. We're actually just out of time. So we'll stop there. And I just want to say a huge thank you for everybody for joining us today, and especially to our speakers who not only have, I think, had a really fascinating conversation and unpacked some of these issues, but also have been incredibly flexible with us today. And I really, really appreciate the flexibility and adaptability in helping us to put this panel together. Yeah, it's been a brilliant conversation, and one that we're going to continue. This really is the very beginning of sort of implementing the LLA long-term strategy in IIED, which we will do with many of the organizations present on this call. Immediately, we're going to be having a follow-up session to this one at CBA. Or at least it feels immediately. It's still about 2 months away. And in particular, that session is really going to focus on some of the things we didn't really get to today in that second breakout group, to really start thinking in a lot more detail about the risks which currently are not actually accounted for in current risk management practices. So hopefully see lots of you in person there in Bangkok. But yes, we will be carrying on that conversation then. So thank you ever so much. I'll let everybody go. If, however, I could just ask the panelists to stay on and turn your cameras on so that we can get a quick photo for Savio so that they can share that in their networks. But everybody else, thank you ever so much, and see you again.